the thing about reading for enjoyment and reading the classics is a lot of times that gets you to consider things like love and beauty and truth and justice and fairness and life itself, life and death. What is the meaning of life? And people don't want to think about these things. They don't want to meditate about this. They don't want to cogitate. They don't want to ponder these things. They don't want to muse on these things. It seems to me that a lot of people are afraid of being alone. Maybe not afraid in the sense that, like they're afraid of the boogeyman or anything like that, but they're just very, perhaps, stupid mosquitoes. Yeah, they're very uncomfortable, shall we say, with being alone. And I have a theory on that, and my theory is that it's because that a lot of people are afraid to think. They're afraid to be alone with their thoughts. Now, yeah, I'm going to be making random waving motions here because of the mosquitoes. And if this keeps up, I'm going to have to come up with a different approach, I guess, but we'll muddle through today. Anyways, I think that part of it is that people are afraid to think. They are afraid of being alone with their thoughts. Now, why do I say that? I think part of it is, a big part of it is that society doesn't really value thinking, in my estimation and in my observation. I think that society actively discourages thinking, especially with independent thought. And you think about, one reason why I say that is because you think about in past, or in recent years, in recent decades, a lot of schools have been engaged in what they call teaching to the test. So in other words, there's been an inordinate emphasis on standardized testing. And so a lot of what passes as education is, you got to know this for the test, so you should be able to do this, this, this. And it's really kind of a cookbook approach, I think, which, I mean, there's two ways to learn. You can learn with a cookbook approach, follow step one, step two, or you can follow a more guided approach, a more Socratic method, which is what I prefer. To me, that seems more natural, and the Socratic method does encourage thinking. When I was teaching at the community college or when I teaching and or tutoring, and students would come to me with a problem, I don't understand this, whatever, I would employ the Socratic method. I'd try to get them to think about what information they were given and how that applied, what information they were given and what did they need to determine, what problem did they have to solve, or what question did they have to answer, and to bridge the gap between what they were given and what kind of answer or what solution they should get. I was trying to bridge that gap by, kind of guiding them with questions. You have this information. What does that tell you? What does that imply? So that was kind of my basic approach. And it went over like a lead balloon. 95+% of my students just hated that. They absolutely hated me asking questions, they would say stuff like, well, if I already knew how to do it, I wouldn't be here asking you, just kind of a totally non-receptive attitude to learning. They just wanted to focus on getting the right answer, which is a whole nother story. Anyways, I think it's related to society discouraging thinking, schools teaching to the test. I think another way that society discourages thinking is, and we've seen this a lot in the past few years with the illness that shall not be named, and of recent memory, right? And there was a lot of pushback against independent thought. There was a great emphasis on groupthink, or the hive mind, if you will. You heard it, all kinds of messaging, propaganda, let's call it propaganda. You heard all kinds of propaganda about, this is what you should do and this is how you should handle it. And anybody who dared go against that was vilified and derided and, everything. So, yeah, that's another example of why I say that society doesn't really encourage thinking, and it actively discourages independent thought. So there's the whole hive mind aspect, or if you want to talk about memes, there's the NPC. The NPC just sits and parrots everything that they hear from the media, from radio or TV or whatever. And if you say anything against that, if you say anything that challenges that, then you're an evil person. And yeah. Anyways, you guys all know what it's been like the past few years. I don't have to go into that. So yeah, that's one thing I'm thinking, that society doesn't really value thinking. Another observation that supports this is, think about, there is an emphasis on constant busyness, and by that I mean not only just, people drive here, drive there, they drop their kids off at soccer practice, or they got to do that to fill their time, what little free time or what little leisure time they have, they fill it with all kinds of activity. So there's a lot of activity, and when you are constantly going like that, you don't really get a chance to think about anything. You're just kind of acting rather than thinking. So I think that engaging in constant busyness, it reminds me of a dog chasing its tail. It just goes around and around and around and around in a circle. And of course, it's getting nowhere. And if you're doing that, then you're not thinking about other things. And we'll get into what I mean by other things in a moment. But yeah, the emphasis on constant busyness. And I think part of that busyness is the way the current tax system and the financial system is set up. I believe that it's designed to keep us in this trap of constant busyness and constant work, and not having, any leisure time, or very little leisure time, if any. So if you're constantly you're constantly at work, you're engaged in that, and then when you get home, you gotta do chores, you gotta do this, you gotta do that, you gotta take your kids here, you gotta wash the laundry, blah, 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 blah. Yet you don't have any quiet time to be able to hear your thoughts. And it seems like, yeah, we have very little leisure time in modern society. I think I read or heard somewhere that actually it seemed like the medieval peasants had more leisure time than we do, which is kind of crazy if you think about it, because we have all these time-saving devices. We got dishwasher, and we got a washing machine, and you don't have to drag your laundry down to the river and beat it on the rocks, and so many things like that. So many devices that are designed to, on the one hand, make our life easier. So we should theoretically have more leisure time, but then we're wrapped up in this busyness and constant working. So we don't have the leisure time. Another thing is, like, it seems like whatever little leisure time we do have, it's often filled with entertainment and amusement. So, and again, I think I understand sometimes you just want to kick back and relax. So you don't want to think about work or anything, or think about stuff, but it's a lot easier to just sit there and be passive and be entertained, or watching the TV, or going to concerts or whatever. And I think that could be an avoidance mechanism to avoid, again, being alone with your thoughts. And I can understand that especially if you work a full day, or a 40-plus hour week, a lot of times you're too tired to think. You don't want to think. You just want to go home and veg out, right? So I think that's part of the issue here. Well, why people are afraid to be alone, or avoid being alone. Yeah, that's better. I forget. That's a better way to phrase it. They avoid being alone because they want to avoid being alone with their thoughts. And kind of related to that, I think, is that people don't really read for enjoyment or relaxation, not like they used to. People used to read the classics. People used to read, like Robinson Crusoe, or even Greek classics like Aristotle's Rhetoric, or that kind of stuff. Now it seems like most people, if they read, it's going to be like business related or self-help, and that's fine to a point. Self-improvement is good, self-help and all that, but the thing is, I think it feeds into this notion that we're avoiding thinking. Let's see. Yeah, so the thing about reading for enjoyment and reading the classics is a lot of times that gets you to consider things like love and beauty and truth and justice and fairness and life itself, life and death. What is the meaning of life? And people don't want to think about these things. They don't want to meditate about this. They don't want to cogitate. They don't want to ponder these things. They don't want to muse on these things. And if you stop and think about the word amuse, I just use the word muse. Muse is a form of meditation or thinking, right? But the word amuse, I looked up the etymology of that. And it said that it was originally from the 15th century, and it meant to divert the attention, which goes back to what I was saying. It's a diversion or an avoidance of going deeper into life instead of all the shallow stuff with work and busyness. So we're kept distracted. And one of the reasons why we're kept distracted is because we're caught up in this rat race. And so we, generally speaking, as a whole, as a society, we don't think about the bigger issues of life, like, why am I here? Or, why is society the way it is with the rat race and the onerous taxes and wars and poverty and, horrible education, and you could just go down the list. Why is society the way it is? Why is it so expensive to go see a doctor, or why is health care, which is a whole nother topic in itself, but why is health care so expensive? We don't think about these things because we're constantly distracted, because we're too tired, because we're working so much, because we're engaged in busyness. And I think the fundamental question, or perhaps the most important question, is this, and it comes from a document. I guess you could call it a document. It comes from the Westminster Shorter Catechism. It's the first question in the Westminster Shorter Catechism, and that is, what is the chief end of man? So it's kind of a little bit archaic language. So if we were to modernize it a little bit, we'd say, what is the highest goal of man? What is man's main purpose in life? What is the chief end of man? And so I'm not going to answer that now. I'll cover that in a future video. But I want to pose this question to you, and I invite you to ponder that. How would you answer that? What is the chief end of man? What is man's main purpose? And by man, don't get hung up on the terminology. Man means human being, okay? So what is the main purpose of human beings? Why are we here? Why do we exist? Think about that. And I want you to ponder that. We can have a discussion in the comments. Please put down what you think. What is the chief end of man? But I will just leave you with this last thought. Answering that question, what is the chief end of man? I believe that is the first step. There's the owl again. I don't know if you can hear that. Anyway, sorry. So answering that question, what is the chief end of man? I believe that's the first step to rising above the box that society wants to put us in constantly. You've heard of, thinking outside the box. How about living outside the box? And if you want to live outside the box, I believe that you need to answer that question. What is the chief end of man? So think about that, and let's talk about it. Put it in the comments, and we can have a discussion. So I hope I've given you something to think about. If so, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe and share it with a friend. And let's have a discussion. What is the chief end of man? I'll talk to you later. Bye.